Hello and welcome to HCR's Cyber Conference. I'm delighted you've joined us today. Now, some of you may be expecting to see the infamous Dr. Dan Hyde in this session. Unfortunately, Dan is unwell and unable to be here today, so you're left with me holding the reins. I'm Claire Holford. I'm a dual qualified dispute resolution lawyer, admitted in both England, Wales and Australia. I'm also head of our defence and security sector for London and the South, and I work closely with defence SMEs and the primes. I act for both companies and individuals involved in cybercrimes and the misuse of confidential information. With me today is Simon Beasley, one of my fellow dispute resolution partners based in our London office. Simon deals with complex commercial issues which often require significant investigation and analysis. Simon acts for a range of clients, from individuals to PLCs, and often his cases involve cross-border issues. We're also delighted to have with us Jerry Bessette. He's a former FBI agent who is now Senior Vice President with Booz Allen Hamilton. Now, for Jerry's bio, I'm afraid I'm going to have to turn to my notes to get this all correct. So Jerry leads the commercial cyber incident response program for his clients. His team addresses the full incident lifecycle, including pre-incident preparation, incident response, and post-incident remediation. Since joining Booz Allen Hamilton, Jerry has led response efforts on several major ransomware attacks and helped Fortune 500 clients understand and address emerging threats. Jerry retired from the FBI after 24 years as a special agent and executive manager. Now, Jerry tells me that in his last assignment, he served as chief of the technical operations section for the FBI Cyber Division, in which he managed the National Cyber Incident Response Team. He also led the FBI investigation into the 2014 cyber attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment. Jerry is a certified information security manager and a certified chief information security officer. So today's esteemed panel will explore and hopefully illuminate the theme of fighting back against cyber attacks. This is a theme that begins even before an attack, with the appropriate cybersecurity measures which need to be implemented to safeguard the personal information that businesses hold on behalf of their customers and for other parties. And just to be clear, GDPR make these appropriate cybersecurity measures mandatory. They apply not only to technological steps, but also organizational measures. Jerry, I'll start with you. What steps and strategies do you suggest that organizations need in terms of pre-attack prevention?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. From a very tactical level, I think there are some simple things organizations can do that can help them be much more resilient. Before I get to them, if I can give you a small analogy, though the many cyber criminals we see out there today, they are sophisticated criminal organizations, but in my 24 years in the FBI, I found criminals to be lazy. So if you take the example of a car park and you have someone that wants to break into a car, they can take a hammer and smash the window. They can purchase on the dark web a sophisticated lock-picking tool, or they can simply walk down a row of cars and check 10 or 20 cars, and they're going to find someone who has failed to lock their doors. The same is basically true in cyber today with these ransomware attackers and cyber criminals that are victimizing companies out there. So the 5 simple things, in my opinion, that companies can do to make themselves a harder target than the next company down the road are: 1, first and foremost, have backups, air-gapped backups. So if you do become the victim of a ransomware attack, you can restore from data and recover your network and continue business operations. Secondarily, multi-factor authentication is extremely important. That way, if the hackers are able to acquire someone's credentials, they won't be able to log back into the network because they won't have the second, the second token. So multi-factor, air-gap backups, endpoint detection and response on the individual laptop or server that's being used. You should have something similar to, there's many famous ones out there, Carbon Black, CrowdStrike has one called Falcon, SentinelOne is another company, but you should have a reliable EDR, endpoint detection and response tool. So if a user clicks on something bad on their individual computer, it'll be stopped right then and there and won't have the opportunity to spread to the network. The next thing is email filtering. Have a security software that'll filter those bad emails and look for executables in the background, so those emails won't even be able to get to the user, and the user will never have the opportunity to click on a bad email. And then lastly, asset and vulnerability management. Keep abreast of critical vulnerabilities and patches that are released, and ensure that you update your networks in a timely fashion, because the hackers out there are aware of critical vulnerabilities, and they write programs to search the internet and look for companies that haven't conducted those patches. And then lastly, asset management. Know what's on your network. We unfortunately have seen time and time again companies maybe decommissioning an older server, and they have already brought the new server online, but they never disconnected the old server from the internet. And the hackers are able to find that and use that as an access point into the network to conduct their cyber attack.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, so moving forward, let's assume that no matter what measures have been implemented, a cyber attack still gets through and a breach happens. And I think it's a safe assumption, because no plan is perfect, and especially when it comes to trying to defend against cybercrime. So what can we do when there's a breach? Simon, we've helped lots of people in these situations. So do you want to give us an example?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, this is becoming a all too common occurrence now. I've definitely seen in the last few years a steady increase in the types of attack and the variety of methods used. And so in terms of how to approach it, I mean, this is very much dependent upon the type of business you are, the method of breach that's been used, and the identity of the wrongdoer. But there is some commonality between some things that you can do. Very quickly, you want to identify as quickly as possible what's happened. The best way to do that really is to get help as soon as possible from qualified people such as ourselves, who ideally you would already know and have organised. They bring in IT forensics and investigators, and depending on scale, people like Jerry. You need to stop the flow of the information and the loss that's occurred, because you need not only to stop what's happened now, but to prevent it from reoccurring. For lots of businesses, though, by that time, the horse has already somewhat bolted, and it's too late. But also important is to understand very quickly if it's been an internal or an external attack, because you need to know if you can trust your current infrastructure to preserve evidence and records of the system, and try to leave as much unaltered as possible, which is why it's important to have experts involved as soon as possible. And then you need to start to think about the aftermath and assessing the potential commercial liabilities and requirements due to any loss of data. And I mean, those are some very general points that apply to most people. But I think we could all come up with a worrying amount of specific examples. So what I've done is I've narrowed down to just a few that focus more on the internal threat. So when the person is actually already involved in the business. And I think fundamentally companies, they want to be able to trust their people. But unfortunately, with that trust comes the opportunity for breach and personal gain. Some of the people I'll speak about were doing this to make themselves more valuable, more attractive or knowledgeable to a prospective employer. Some were seeking profit, and to be honest, others were just out of spite. But whatever the motive is, most of the businesses involved, the data or the information taken was very much at the core of the value of the business. And the immediate and obvious examples of businesses like this are anything from recruitment companies to estate agents, but also throughout any form of commerce where there's highly confidential information, sensitive details, corporate strategies, large commercial deals, even the recipe for Coca-Cola. You know, these are all things that are at the core of the business. And I mean, some of the clients I've seen before our instruction, I stress, became aware that some of their data was being leaked externally due to people within that database actually being contacted by third parties. And sadly, after a small internal investigation, they found out it was one of the senior people in their IT department. So once the employee left following a meeting, which they must have foreseen was coming, they'd already organised to steal a full copy of the database and began breaking it up and selling it to third parties, including some competitors. So obviously, for that client, it was a huge hit. The very person that they entrusted to protect them and their commercial enterprise was the person who has betrayed them and put them at such risk. So they brought in a forensic IT expert who reviewed their entire system, protected the infrastructure of it, and actually found some things that had been left behind which would have allowed continued and repeat access to their hardware. And once they'd made it secure, that's when I was brought on board. And following instruction, we managed to find evidence not on the client's database or within their systems, but actually we started to get in contact with companies this individual had worked for subsequently. And he'd left them sometimes under a cloud. And with their permission, they gave us the ability to access their devices that had been used during that time. And through that method and some electronic forensics, we managed to recover a huge amount of data, much of which was utterly worthless. But within it was some absolutely pivotal emails, which clearly proved that this individual was not only the thief, but was actually now still selling the stolen data. So that allowed us immediately to take action, to issue proceedings. We managed to find out who it had been sold to because the individual was required to deliver up the information. So some companies had received it even innocently, not realizing the origin of it, but that didn't matter. It allowed us to trace everywhere it had been, have it removed and deleted, and we were able to receive a good settlement for our client. But that was a systematic and sophisticated attack, which was premeditated and planned, but with a methodical approach to working through the issues and a creative strategy to try to get evidence that wouldn't have otherwise been available, we managed to get a good result for that client. But it's rare in my experience that it's always the people in IT. It's usually, in most cases, for me, somebody who has worked there and just had access to the systems. And I mean, one example I can think of was a very large international recruitment company where the employee decided that upon leaving, they were going to help themselves to a large amount of the client and contact database. And on their way out, they did this in a way that didn't leave any trace on the system in any way, which obviously I won't go into the details of how they managed that through fear of arming some scrupulous individual in copying the methodology. But the company didn't have the evidence or the appetite to take on a fight against the person that they actually knew had stolen. So what we did was we set about actually trying to put them in a better position for future. And that's when external IT experts were brought in to go through their system, improve the security. But they also retained myself to advise on the legal side. And one of the pieces of advice we gave was to have email addresses added each month to their database, which linked directly to the founder's own email. And these email addresses were used for nothing but to sit dormant on the databases. And nothing happened for months, and that was really the end of it, until lo and behold, 6 months later, employee number 2 decides to follow their friend employee number 1 to the new competitor. And again, they did nothing but watch, but they couldn't find any real trace of anything they'd done. 2 months later, one of the email addresses, which previously had been added to the system, started to receive emails explaining that employee 2 was now available to work with them at the new company. So, that's no smoking gun. But what it did do is having those email addresses shrank the window of time when the theft would have occurred down to a specific month. That specific month allowed us to review the systems in detail to see who and how people had accessed that data, even in their day-to-day course of business. And then it also turned out as good fortune for us that employee 2 actually was the only person who had left the business with several months either side of the theft. So although we didn't have this dream piece of evidence, which rarely is available, we were able to use all of these pieces of information to produce a picture which it would have been fanciful for it to have been anyone but the second employee who left. At which point, when that was put to them, they very kindly admitted what happened, and we didn't even have to issue proceedings on that one. We just obtained undertakings. They had to deliver up, destroy the data. But I'm sure you've got plenty of examples, Claire, of similar things.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Slightly similar. So an example I've worked on in a dispute, it was an external hack. So it was a push payment scam, and it fell outside the CRM code. And company A, which was my client, paid company B £58,000 as a result of an email chasing payment of their invoice. Now, the fraudulent email had some clues in it. It said it was sent from a Galaxy smartphone. It also contained a very hard to see underscore embedded in the company email address. and it was from an individual, not from this company's accounts department. But unfortunately, my client A, didn't notice any of these anomalies. Now, company B that received the payment had very poor credit control procedures, and it took them 3 months to chase for the unpaid invoice. And it was only 3 months as a result of that chasing that it was uncovered that my client had paid a fraudulent payer, as a result of this fraudulent email. Now, Company A and Company B both blamed each other. They both instructed solicitors. Company B threatened court proceedings. Now, we did instruct independent IT specialists to investigate, but before we actually turned to the good old Have I Been Pawned website, and that gave us a very early indication that actually, yes, Company B had had several previous hacks. So we argued that not only did Company B not have secure systems, they had inadequate procedures, because both in their credit control and in the fact that they shared company emails. But also, despite previous hacks to Company B never sent any warning emails to their customers to say, guys, watch out for fraudulent emails, especially involving bank details. Please contact us if you think of anything suspicious. They did nothing. So incredibly as well, neither Company A or Company B had cyber insurance to cover this type of incident. So it was blame game negotiations. Great for the lawyers, not so good for the clients. But we actually, on a without prejudice basis, entered a settlement on a 50-50 basis. Both lawyers realised that both of our clients were to blame, and they were partly responsible because they could have had better procedures in place. Now, as is often the case in the dispute world, I generally only get one client once for a dispute because people do learn from these things. But it's about educating, especially on cyber attacks and what can happen, and making sure you've got the procedures in place. So there can be value in fighting back after an attack and instructing lawyers. But what about the situation that we haven't addressed so far? And that's when an attack is a continuing one. And I'm thinking in particular of a ransomware attack, when a ransom is demanded in return for the release of information and other intellectual property, IT assets that have been taken prisoner. There are a whole host of problems around these situations, not least if you can or should negotiate. And the big question about whether a ransom demand should be met or not. So I understand, Jerry, this is something you have a lot of experience of, both from your time in the FBI and also in your current role at Booz Allen Hamilton. So could you tell us about some of that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. You're absolutely right. Ransomware is becoming more and more prevalent. The push payment scams can be very damaging to organizations, but ransomware has resulted in some very large front page losses recently. And approximately 60 to 70% of the forensic matters we are seeing involve ransomware attacks. These criminal organizations have really taken it to a new level. And in addition to encrypting the network and denying the victim company use of their corporate network assets, they're also, as you mentioned, stealing IP or confidential data, financials, information of value, and then extorting the company. So they're demanding a ransom payment for not only the decryptors so the company can regain use of their network, but they are also demanding payment for not releasing the data that they've stolen publicly. In addition, we're now seeing them also trying to threaten key corporate executives. They guess at the email convention, naming convention, so last name _ first name at company.com. We have seen press releases from criminal organizations announcing that they are establishing call centers to try to call a company's victim company's business partners, customers. They want to do everything possible to create this overall sense of fear and panic within the victim company and make the company believe that the only way out is through payment. One of the things we try to do is bring calm to the situation. First and foremost, we try to emphasize to the company that you're actually in control. Yes, your network is encrypted, but you have what the hackers want, and that's money. Secondarily, we try to emphasize that negotiation does not equal payment in all cases. So we always recommend that you initiate negotiations. with the hackers, if for no other reason than to give your forensic firm and your internal IT firm time to get a handle on the situation. How extensive is the attack? Do you have backups? Are the backups safe? Can you recover from backups? Do you actually know what type of information they took from you? Because the reality is the hackers want your money. They don't want your data. And then what is your strategy? Have you taken the time before the attack to think through your corporate strategy? To pay or not pay is truly a business decision on the part of the victim company. And each option has certain ramifications. And we can most certainly help a company think through, if I pay, this is going to happen. If I don't pay, these are typically the things we see that are going to happen. But they need to have a strategy and a starting point when they contact the threat actors. And strategies, the most efficient strategies are ones that they've thought through, typically in conjunction with their counsel, their attorneys, helping them think through the implications of that strategy before they find themselves in a crisis situation where the network doesn't work. Their customers or business partners are calling them, cutting off digital connections with them. There may be stories that are being leaked to the media. That's really not the time to try to think through the strategy. So we always encourage them to determine what their strategy is in a more calm situation, and then implement that strategy as you start negotiations with the hackers, and then determine, based upon the severity of the incident, make an appropriate business decision as to whether or not you want to attempt to reach a settlement or not reach a settlement.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a tangled web with a new breed of attacker. So there's no perfect answer. Do you pay or not pay? And it's, again, you've got to plan in advance and have a strategy so you know what you're doing. So there's a great quote from Frank Abagnale, the guy that played the guy that was played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Catch Me If You Can. You may remember that Frank took a deal from the FBI and he went on to become one of the first cybercrime investigations who used his criminal knowledge to then solve some of the earlier cases. And Frank famously said back then that in most of the cybercrimes he solved, it wasn't some mastermind sat in Moscow or Beijing, but it was the guy in the next office down the corridor that was behind it. And I guess my question is, what can you do if it isn't the guy next door? Cybercrime is borderless, and how can you fight back if the perpetrator is in another country? Simon, this is perhaps a question for you about how you advise a client in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, jurisdiction is a big topic, and I could probably do a talk on it on its own. But not even in a cybercrime scenario, jurisdiction as an area, if it's not dealt with properly from a legal perspective, has the ability to increase the costs and complexity of something to a case that would otherwise be successful, and it can make it almost entirely uneconomic to run. So, you'll all be very pleased to know I'm not going to lead us down an explanation of all the competing laws between countries and the ways in which we sit through textbooks wrangling through those. But what I'm going to try to do is suggest initially that it's kept in everybody's mind as important to understand the level of involvement of jurisdiction and some of the steps that can assist you with it. Now, if you're fortunately in a position where it's a breach of contract, well, then you're very likely to have a jurisdiction clause in your contract, which helpfully denotes the country's laws that will apply, where the dispute will be dealt with, and you can just go according to that. So unless there's something which changes that position, everybody knows where they stand. If a crime is committed, I'm sure Jerry will know far more about this than me, but ultimately there's a specific force which has jurisdiction that can investigate it. They may have cross-border task forces, or work with other police forces and agencies. But the issue with a cyber attack is you're very much at the mercy of the situation you were presented with. If it was a former employee, as in one of my examples, then their breach of confidence, the employee relationship will probably be covered by a contract, which will have that jurisdiction clause in it. So again, wonderful. But that's helpful because it's your anchor for jurisdiction. It's quite clear where it is. But the problem is when your attacker isn't an employee and has never even potentially been to the country where their victim is. So the problem then becomes about identifying which countries are effectively involved, their laws, then assessing the level of judicial cooperation between those countries, because the issue really is either you need the evidence to identify the wrongdoer or to establish exactly how the wrongdoing itself occurred. It's always valuable to have a legal counterpart in the other country which is involved, as that will, at an early stage, allow you to identify which country's legislation is going to be most likely to assist you in achieving the type of outcome you're seeking. And we also benefit from at HCR from having our own international team, which helps with this, obviously. But the law of many countries is derived from how their legal system has developed, their approach to individual and corporate rights, the use and holding of data, what they see as a civil or criminal offence, how they deal with how these investigated, where they should be investigated as a crime first. And an example in practice really of this is how many countries and parties and commercial entities elect to use the courts of England and Wales for jurisdictional issues, even though neither party or anything that's involved in the contract may even be anything to do with England. But such is how the English court's independence and structure is respected around the world. So I suppose I'd summarise with jurisdiction by saying that it's something you should consider at the outset of everything, whether you're considering mapping out the potential ways there could be an attack upon your company, whether you're entering into a commercial contract or agreement. And it should be one of the first things you think about if there is any subsequent legal action because something's occurred.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. That's great. So that's fighting back from a legal perspective. Jerry, are there other steps and other lines of investigation or attack that you might be able to pursue?
Yeah, we've seen some successful law enforcement actions, and these are the result of international cooperation between governmental law enforcement authorities. That comes through information sharing. I think it's very important for the victim companies, under appropriate legal advice, to contact authorities, whether that be the NCA in the UK, the European Cybercrime Center for the EU, the FBI for the United States, and share what information you have uncovered regarding your attack. That's, copies of the malware, what we call indicators of compromise, the signatures of the attack, the IP addresses that were found in the course of the investigation, as well as if you decide that it was necessary to make a payment, what wallet address you made that payment to. That's very important because no one particular cybercrime attack is going to produce enough information for law enforcement agencies to do the ultimate thing, which is either arrest the individuals involved or seize their assets, take their money away. So it takes information from a variety of different cybercrime attacks, and the law enforcement agencies are successful in putting that information together and identifying the pattern that develops and the commonalities which will lead to those law enforcement actions. So earlier in the year, in 2021, we saw the FBI, United States authorities, and the Bulgarian cybercrime police take down a criminal ransomware group known as the Networker Group, and they were able to seize the what we call the infrastructure, the servers and the computers that they were using to conduct their attack, as well as seize their assets. And they were also able to arrest a Canadian individual and put him in jail. And seize, I believe, $27 million. And that took information sharing. We have also seen the French authorities, in concert with the Ukrainians, seize a ransomware group known as eGregor. More recently, with the devastating Colonial Pipeline attack that caused gas shortages in the United States up and down the eastern coast of the United States, the Colonial Pipeline company paid a $5 million ransom. And shortly after the ransom was paid, the FBI announced that they were able to seize back $2.3 million through money flow analysis. They did not provide any additional details as to how they identified the location of the money, but most certainly that took information sharing on the part of the victim company and quickly sharing that information with law enforcement so they could take actions that are going to put a dent in the operations of the criminals and have them maybe ideally think twice about conducting these types of crimes, as well as make it more difficult for them to conduct these types of crimes. And that's how you're going to ideally, in the long term, stop this from happening.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. It's certainly about law enforcement cooperation. So what happens when the money you're chasing is in cryptocurrency, Jerry? My understanding is that ransomware demands often want funds paid in crypto. You've got direct experience of that. So what can you tell us about using the demands through crypto?
Yeah, with almost always the ransomware groups, the criminal organizations, are demanding payment in cryptocurrency. It used to almost always be in Bitcoin. We are seeing that change now, and one interesting tactic that we are seeing, and I believe it's because of the law enforcement success in tracking cryptocurrencies, such as the money flow analysis that was done, which enabled the FBI to seize back $2.3 million in cryptocurrency before the criminals were able to actually convert that and put it in their bank accounts. They in the course of the negotiations, they take you down a certain path, say they want payment in Bitcoin, 55 Bitcoin, 100 Bitcoin. And throughout the whole negotiations, they say Bitcoin, Bitcoin, Bitcoin. And then once a particular settlement amount is reached, at the last minute, they switch to a different form of digital currency, say something similar to Monero. I believe they do this because they feel like it would be harder for law enforcement to track at the last minute. And then Bitcoin is probably the most popular digital currency and the most advances. There's been the most focus on Bitcoin in terms of tracking Bitcoin. So I believe the hackers feel that they are safer by switching to a different form of digital currency, and that they are also somewhat hiding their path by asking you for Bitcoin and at the last minute switching to Monero. And if you don't have the ability to pay in Monero, they will accept Bitcoin, but they charge an extra fee of 10% is what we've seen, an upcharge basically for use of Bitcoin, because they incur a greater risk in accepting Bitcoin versus some of the other forms of digital currency.
That's really interesting, Jerry. That's something I wasn't aware of. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting discussion, and we've covered a lot of ground, from preparing for an attack to dealing with a continuing attack to post-attack strategies, and also, of course, our favourite subject, or mine and Simon's, the litigation. So before we move to audience questions, I'm going to ask each of you for your best takeaway advice to give. So I think mine would be, if something's not right, you're probably right. So cyber incident response planning is the absolute key. You need to look at your threat model, have an investigation plan, and get the experts involved quickly. Lawyers love the phrase time is of the essence, but it certainly is when it comes to a crypto attack. So Simon, what would be your takeaway advice?
I think know your experts before any of the problems occur. Having a plan ahead of time that allows you to immediately get started with identifying, repairing the damage, stopping the flow of information is key. Because, as you know, Claire, from our position as solicitors, the later we're involved, the far less we can do and the far greater cost it generally is to a client. So the earlier you can have us involved, the better it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Jerry, what about you?
I often tell clients that speed matters in a cyber attack, and don't think it won't happen to you. And I can relate that back to the final advice that each one of you gave: have a plan, know your experts. And by having a plan and knowing how you're going to respond to an attack, and knowing who you're going to call to support you in responding to that attack, is going to allow you to achieve what I call the prime objective of speed matters. Hackers today, they have rules that if you don't contact them within 3 days, they double your ransom. So we had a victim company who had a $12 million ransom demand, and they basically struggled and didn't know what to do. They had internal arguments for 7 days on who to call and when to call them. And finally, in the middle of a weekend, at 8:30 on a Saturday morning, they reached out for help. And so when we made first contact with the hackers, the very first thing the hackers said is, your ransom demand was $12 million. Now it's $24 million because you failed to contact us within 3 days. So speed matters in a ransomware attack, and it's going to be affected by the types of things that you all mentioned. And it could cost you twice the amount of money to recover.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Jerry. So we've got audience questions coming in. So I'm going to start with some of those. So Jerry, can you give us some examples of data hostage situations?
Yeah, so data hostage situations are going to be, for example, when they take your whole customer list and their bank account numbers. So they're going to encrypt your network, and then they're going to ask for payment for return of the data. Unfortunately, once the data leaves the network, it's gone, and I think you need to seek appropriate and prudent legal advice from counselors such as yourself in terms of what the implications are of that. Because even if you do reach settlement, we ask that they return a full copy of the data so we can compare that to what our investigation thought they had forensically. But the data is gone. So they will seek payment for two things: for decryptors to unencrypt your network, as well as not releasing your data publicly in the media. And if you can recover from backups, which is one of the 5 key things I said that people need to have, and I consider backups probably the most significant thing of those 5, that gives us a leg up in negotiations with the hackers, and we can immediately tell them, I don't need decryptors. And then you're just negotiating for the data, and if that's even something you want to do. Because once your data is gone, it's gone, and you have to assume that it's out.
Thanks, Jerry. That's great. This is a question we haven't touched on, and it's actually an interesting one. And Jerry, again for you, what happens if you can't identify the attackers? What happens in that situation?
If you can't identify the group, well, they're still going to have to give you a wallet address if they want to be paid.
Okay.
This is kind of strange. These groups, oddly enough, I can only think of one time in the past 2 years of ransomware attacks where the group did not identify themselves. They are actually very proud of who they are. It's almost, they more often than not say, you have been attacked by our evil, or you have been attacked by the Maze Group, almost as if you should be privileged to have been attacked by them. And they're very concerned about their reputation because, insurance companies often underwrite, provide coverage for the loss if a ransom payment is made. And if it was made public that the ransomware groups did not hold up their end of the bargain, such as providing decryptors and things of that nature, the insurance companies would stop paying them. So they are very proud of who they are and their reputation. But if the group doesn't identify themselves, we're still going to follow the same procedures. We're going to ask them, how much money they're demanding, how are we supposed to pay them, but even before we get to that, we're going to ask them, what kind of data they're holding. And we're going to ask them for what we call proof of life samples, so we can, one, ensure that data really is ours. We've had instances where hacking groups have provided us a sample of the data they purported to have stolen from us, and it was actually from another company.
Okay, interesting. So Jerry, you are popular today. So Jerry, have you worked with clients who have not paid ransoms, and what did they do instead?
Yeah, so we absolutely have worked with clients that have not paid ransoms. And as a retired law enforcement officer, my wish would be that we never paid another ransom. That's the quickest way to put these people out of business. Just don't pay a ransom anymore. Unfortunately, that is largely affected by the amount of planning and thought and preparation that has gone into a situation before it actually occurs, what we call left of breach. Do you have a plan? Do you know who your experts are? Do you know what information is critical to your organization that could cause the type of significant damage that would, make someone want to pay a ransom? And do you have backups? And so typically the companies that don't pay have prepared for that the most and have backups, and they are able to restore from backup. And that's where they're most successful. They've put the time and effort into it. And we're seeing a lot of that occur now in the United States since the Colonial Pipeline attack. Many companies are not only asking their information security experts, are we prepared? But they're asking for proof of it. And if you do have a plan and you do know who your experts are, have you tested it? Have you conducted a tabletop exercise and walked through the procedures? Has everybody read the plan? And it's the companies that have done the most practice and exercise and planning before an event occurs. And, the team that goes to the championship didn't get there in one day. They played a long season and many games to actually get there. And really the same thing works in a ransomware attack. The victim that comes out on top and doesn't have to pay the ransom is the victim that's put the most practice and preparation in before the attack.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, another statement from the audience, and they're asking whether you agree to this statement. So it is, many cyber consultants say never pay the ransom, because if you do, you'll then be sold on the dark web as a soft target and the demands will increase in number and value. Do you agree with that statement, and have you got any experience of that?
Again, the decision to pay a ransom is ultimately that of the client. And most certainly, when you do pay a ransom, we always recommend that clients conduct additional testing and put as many security measures as they can on their network, because you are going to see an overwhelming amount of increased what we call scanning activity of your network and other people attempting to break into your network. Because if word gets out that, for example, Colonial Pipeline made a $5 million ransom payment, every other hacking group out there is going to want to go back at them. So while the particular ransomware group that conducted the attack will provide decryptors, there's no guarantee that no one else is going to attack you, because after all, these people are criminals.
Yeah, thanks. Simon, a question to you actually. So how much does a cyber attack cost? I guess that's being aimed at the sort of maybe the potential legal cost, but I'll hand that one over to you.
Yeah, that's a pretty big question, so I'll try to narrow it down as such. But I mean, the honest answer is, from a commercial perspective, probably your entire business potentially. It could be everything you've worked for, the entire share value. It could be the whole business. From a legal perspective, obviously the first thing is, are you insured? Insurance makes obviously the world of difference. And Jerry's already touched upon, the investment that you've put in terms of preparation, systems in place, disaster relief from these sort of things happening. From a legal perspective, it's never less than thousands. It's just how many. The earlier we're brought in, as I said earlier before, the better it is for clients, because the more we can do, the more options we have. But it's also dictated quite a lot by the strategy of the clients. If the clients have a never pay attitude and pursue every wrongdoer to the nth degree, then it's going to cost them a lot in terms of initial work, investigation, preparation, bringing the claim and seeing the claim through. Because obviously not only we've got the breach, you've got to assess the damage, locate the individuals who have caused it and see it through, and then enforce it against them. Very often the basis of the involvement of the court is to get injunctive relief, which it will allow us to stop certain things happening or recover certain things. But it's very much dependent on the commercial approach people want to take. Some clients just simply try to learn from the mistake and don't allow it to happen in future, and use the time and money to invest in protecting the infrastructure moving forward. But it really, as I say, is dictated by the way in which commercially the business wants to respond to an attack like that.
Thanks, Simon. So I'm being asked, who should you contact first in a cyber attack? Well, I think my view would probably be, go to the person or the team that holds the logs, that holds the data, that knows what they're doing in your company, but also contact a lawyer, because through us, we can then start getting forensics involved and just help lead and manage the investigation. And it comes back to the advice we've spoken about already. It's speed, it's time, it's what have you got? Have you got your backups? What systems have you got in place? So, Jerry, another question to you, please. What is your top ransom negotiation strategy or technique? What would be the top of the pile?
Yeah. We have proprietary techniques at Booz Allen, and we don't talk specifics about the techniques we use, but in general, here's some general recommendations. First and foremost, have a strategy. As I mentioned, understand that negotiation is not payment. I always recommend, that you contact the attackers. We have had clients that have said from the get-go, we will never pay. Talk is cheap. As long as you're talking to the attackers, they think the money's in play. It's, I think back to, when we had what we called barricaded subjects in the FBI, and someone, attempted to rob the bank, the police showed up, and now you have a hostage situation. And the longer you're able to keep that individual who's holding people hostage engaged in conversation with you, the less time they have to think about bad things that they can do to the hostages. And the longer they think they're actually going to get away with the crime, and you're going to bring a helicopter in to fly them to safety. I think generally the same applies in ransomware negotiations. As long as you are talking to the attackers, they think the money's in play. There's a chance they might get paid. They don't want your data. When you see really bad crimes happen on the news, whether it's in the United States or the United Kingdom or other parts of Europe, you always see the newscaster say, the motive is not yet known. Police do not know why this occurred. And though ransomware is an insidious form of malware and attack on companies that causes millions and millions of dollars of harm, the unique thing is we know the motive right up front. The motive is money. That's all they want. They don't want your data. So I would encourage companies to think through this and say, what is our strategy if we get attacked? In terms of negotiation. Negotiation is not payment. And what are the situations that could happen to us that would cause us to want to make a business decision to pay? And then, we never lied to the attackers. We've seen attackers release copies of the whole negotiation with the victim and, approach it from a business perspective, it's basically a business deal.
Have you ever come across the situation where it was a staff member that was holding the data ransom? And if so, what happened in that situation?
Is that for me?
Yeah, it's a question for you. Sorry, Jerry. Yes.
Yeah. So, I think depending on which security study you use, still 40 to 45% of, all cyber attacks involve an insider. The insider threat is very significant. Simon mentioned disgruntled employees that want to leave and go to another company. You could have an employee that feels they didn't get the promotion or the recognition they deserve. And with what's called ransomware as a service, if you can find your way to the dark web, you can easily purchase a ransomware package, or you can hire someone to conduct an attack. So I think that happens more often than we think it happens. And I would highly encourage the victim company to seek appropriate legal counsel and pursue criminal actions against the individual. The investigation is going to be the same forensically. We're going to want to see, how they got into the network, what information they accessed, how it was exfiltrated. The twist with an insider is that they may be actually monitoring the network. So companies also need to think through, if we are not positive that we have containment and what we call eradication of the attackers from the network, where are we going to communicate? Which is why, with appropriate, more often than not, any of the matters I've been involved in, the lawyers prefer to have verbal communications on update calls rather than putting things in writing, which could create, what we privilege issues. Yeah,
no, absolutely. We're being asked collectively as a panel, what's our view on cyber insurance? So from my view, I think that the options for cyber insurance are obviously extending every year that goes by. And I think coverage is getting better for all different types of cyber attack. You're never going to have a cyber insurance policy that's going to cover everything and it's going to be an automatically, yes, you're covered. Simon, what's your view on cyber insurance?
I think for any business, the cost of insurance, compared to the benefit, which one day when you need it, it's got to be worth having. I think the important thing is making sure that you understand what your policy does and doesn't cover, because at the end of the day, one cyber insurance is not another. Some will want control of negotiations, some will be for paying sums to settle it, some will put caps on it, some will require you to have certain internal procedures and to follow them. And, I'm not saying that they would, but I'm sure some insurance companies would very much look for fault on the part of people with their internal procedures, which invalidate the policy. So, I think it's a very good thing to have, but don't just get it so you feel warm and put it in a drawer and forget it. You've got to understand what your policy covers, what it requires from you, and make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing with it. So it's part of an overall strategy as well. You know how you might be attacked, the policy you have and why you have it, rather than just going to a broker asking for some kind of cover and then feeling like you've done enough once you've got it.
Jerry, do you have a view on cyber insurance and what it can do?
Yeah, I have served as an outsourced chief information security officer for several companies. One was a large international multi-billion-dollar a year group, and cyber insurance is most certainly a critical part of any strategy. When you look at the risks that your company faces, you accept some risk, you mitigate risk, and you transfer risk. And cyber insurance is a means of risk transference. And I echo what Simon said. I often run into people that aren't aware if they even have cyber insurance and what their coverage contains. One, my thought is it's absolutely part of a successful cybersecurity strategy, but don't see it as an end all. You still have significant responsibility. And again, the more you do and the more you think about and plan for and put in place before an attack actually happens, the better you'll respond. And also, you can go to your insurance company and say, I'm at much better risk. Look at all the things I've done to prevent an attack from happening, and if it does happen, I can quickly respond and mitigate the damage. Therefore, I'm at much better risk and I should have better rates.
Yeah, no, that's great. Jerry, this is a fantastic question to end on. And I'm smiling as I read it, but is working in the FBI like what we see on the TV? Come on, you've got to have a story behind that one.
Absolutely not. On TV, typically you see about 30 agents with the best technology in the world working one investigation. And the reality is that the vast majority of the 11,000 FBI agents and the 25,000 professional support people in the FBI work extremely hard every day. And typically one single agent has about 25 or 30 investigations they're conducting. And in a lot of cases, though, technology is very important. The use of the technology in conducting investigations, there's a lot of what I call the human element. There's a lot of reading, understanding the law, the elements of the crime, and looking for that one piece that stands out, that's unusual, that's going to help you solve the crime. And technology can help you with that, but it can't replace the human interaction. So it's unfortunately not like it is on TV. It's not, you watch these TV shows about the FBI and other law enforcement organizations where there's constant excitement, and it's I wouldn't say constant boredom, but it's there is excitement in the FBI, but there's also a lot of detailed work that goes in behind it.
No, it's brilliant. And Jerry, just like to say an absolute huge thanks for you coming all the way from the States to join our cyber conference and to join this panel. It's been absolutely brilliant, and really pleased with the amount of questions. So for anyone else that has questions, please put them online. We'll answer them. We can come back to them. So for now, it just remains for me to thank Simon Beasley, Commercial Dispute Resolution Partner in London. Jerry, huge thanks to you for coming over again and for all the questions and the audience participation. So that's been great. So that's the end of our session. But as I say, any other questions, direct them online and we'll come back to you.